Get it together, Mike. Come on, you got 2.5 more to do.
Hello, my name is Henry and welcome to Pinkbike's Summer Field Test. This is very exciting because this year we have e-bikes. We're in Sun Peaks and we have the brand new Yeti 160e. Now this, as the name suggests, has a 160mm travel at the back paired to a 170mm fork, and it puts it firmly in the enduro category. But how does this bike compare to offerings from Norco, Common Style and Specialized, some of whom are old hands at the e-bike game by now? Well, we've come here to put it to the test. So, the geometry. This bike uses modern, if not particularly aggressive geometry, with a 64.5 head tube angle combined to a nice and steep 78 seat tube angle. In regards to reach, a small starts at 430mm and it goes all the way through to an extra large for the Arctic Monkeys fans at 505mm of reach. Now I'm 6 foot on the nose, or 183 centimeters, and I ride this large, which is 480mm. It also has a nice and long uninterrupted seat tube to give riders a wider array of choice when it comes to the amount of drop. So now for the main event, what you're all here for, the suspension system. So this Sixfinity suspension layout, which has apparently been developed behind the scenes by Yeti for years, isn't totally dissimilar to the Switch Infinity layout you might be more familiar with. That's because the lower link changes direction part way through its travel, much like the Switch Infinity system you may well be aware of. The 6-bar suspension system comes with 3 different chips to help you choose the amount of progression on your bike. So it's either 25, 30 or 35%, and those adjustments do affect the rear travel by a small 2mm. You do so by changing the chip just at the low of the shock, and I think it's a really cool adjustment, and I would love to see more bike brands take this approach. The Yeti uses a Fox 38 with 170mm travel on the front. Now this fork has a Grip 2 damper with an e-bike tune from Fox. Now what that essentially means is that it just has a bit more compression compared to your standard tune. Now the Burley fork is paired to a Fox X2 at the back, but how do we get to the top of the Ruddy Hill in the first place? Well, that of course is where the motor comes in. With this bike, it uses a 630 watt-hour battery in a Shimano EP8 system. It has 85 Nm of torque with a 500 watts maximum. What does any of this mean? Well, that's why we took it up on the mountain and compared it to its rivals to find out.
All right, it's finally time to talk about how this brand new Yeti e-bike works on the trails. But first, to get to the good stuff, as always, we've got to do a whole bunch of climbing. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so this bike, I predominantly rode it on technical single track climbs, like most of these bikes, and I found that it had really good grip. It's actually slightly more conservative in the angles than something like the Common Style or the Norco.
Yeah.
And that's where it kind of reaped the benefit, I feel. It has loads of support, especially, it's got that nice balance, it's supported, but also it really grips.
Right, I would agree with that. So I did a ton of fire road climbing on this bike, doing the battery testing in 4,569 feet in an hour and 20 minutes before the battery conked out. So a whole bunch of fire road climbing.
Now this was a bike that it definitely really enjoyed, and it was actually very good. And not necessarily hitting things fast and trying to trick your way up there. It had enough grip that you could put it in the eco mode. And actually for me, it had more than enough grip just to always make its way up.
Matt, would you agree? It sounds like Henry is saying that this is the best technical climber of the bunch, thanks to a lot of grip and a relatively steep head angle compared to some of these other e-bikes we have here.
Yeah, I think this one sat at 64.5 and it had quite a low front end, which definitely helped you climb. Mm-hmm. Obviously with the powertrain and the really active suspension, as long as you kept those short cranks spinning, yeah, you had traction for days and could climb pretty much anything on this thing.
Okay, we're talking about descending now, and does that suspension and how active it is, how supple it is, does that help the bike's cause on the descents or does it hurt it?
I really like the feeling of this Yeti. It climbs really well and it descends also with that same feel of lots and lots of grip. However, and there is a bit of a however, when you're riding it on really steep trails and you're riding it fast, that slightly steeper head tube angle combined with a bike that doesn't sit too far deep into its stroke, which effectively slackens it out, it means with all the weight of an e-bike, you're almost kind of at risk of overtaking the front wheel. Obviously you never would, but compared to something like the Common Style or the Norco, which felt a lot more planted and a lot more stable at high speed, this felt a bit more restless, I'd say.
Okay. Could you also say that it felt a bit more playful and maybe compatible with tight corners and stuff like that?
Absolutely. This bike is, for me, compared to something like the Norco or the Common Style, is night and day with how maneuverable it is and how you can kind of shuffle the bike around, as you play with the levels of grip. I mean, I think this bike, in terms of the descending, again, we've spoken about the other reviews, but some people come to e-biking after mountain biking for 20 years and they want something that is like the Norco. It is like a sled. Other people actually are kind of newer to it and they want something that it's less an intimidating prospect. I would say that the Yeti kind of falls into that gap. It rides like you expect it to ride. It's not very extreme, and on flatter trails, not forgetting that not everyone has Sunpeak's bike park on their doorstep. It really comes alive.
Matt, you did some time testing on this bike, which means you were going pretty quick on it. Can you speak to the handling a little bit at that limit? What does that feel like?
Yeah, it was pretty surprising. I did one of the first laps on the Yeti, and it happened to be a time lap, and it actually went faster than the previous two. Also, one of the Kenevo laps I thought was going to be the fastest, and the Yeti topped it. And I can't really explain why. I felt like it was a little bit more nimble in terms of the front end handling. It was a lot of heavy on the front wheel feel. But yeah, that rear suspension was really, really good. We rode it in the linear setting and then in the progressive setting, but I found the linear setting to be more than enough bottom out control and mid-stroke.
All right, what about in the tight stuff? So Henry talked a little bit about the bike's head angle, which is a touch steeper. Does that help the bike in the tight stuff? I mean, your time was faster, but I want to talk about feel. How does it feel in that steep stuff and tight stuff?
Yeah, in the steep stuff, it put me a little bit more forward, but the chainstays are relatively short for the e-bike in comparison to the other on tests. And once we got into the tighter sections, I could really get up on the front and turn quick.
All right, so you guys are gonna go for an e-bike ride. We're here in BC. Matt, I know you really like that Norco VLT. Where does the new Yeti sit compared to that monster truck? Is the Yeti close to that in its abilities, or is it a different kind of e-bike, maybe a little bit more playful and nimble?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit more playful and nimble. It's a little bit lighter. This one's at 51 pounds, and it has a little bit more conservative geometry that might reward more of an all-around rider. It doesn't quite have that same plow or push through feeling where the front wheel is going to go over things first. It's a little bit more behind you feeling as you are on top of the bike, but the suspension holds up and it works really well.
Okay, and that brings us to the component highs and lows. Number one, this thing had an axis dropper on it, Henry. I love that thing. I noticed that you had it listed here as a pro. Tell me about it.
The reason the AXS is so good on e-bikes is one, there are already too many wires.
Yeah.
And that's just, doesn't look very nice, quite frankly.
It's horrible.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And secondly, when you're on an e-bike, because you might find yourself, going up techier stuff more often, or actually trying to make a day of just riding really tech stuff, just being able to press the button for half a second and know you're going to lose that much height
for tech climbs,
just to get the saddle out the way a touch.
Speaking like someone who loves tech climbs, Henry.
It actually really works.
Yeah.
It's great.
All right, let's move on to cons. Matt, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, we did have the top end Yeti e-bike build. So of course, it's pretty hard to fault all the Fox factory suspension and the wireless dropper. One thing that did stand out though was the brakes. We had the Code RSCs, which are awesome, and it had a 220 up front, but why not throw a 220 out back? I mean, we're trying to slow down an e-bike, doing some big descents out here in Sun Peaks.
Okay, let's move on to models and pricing. And I've already mentioned the price for this one. We have the T1 Turk. That's the most Yeti of all the Yetis. It's $12,300. It comes with Axis seat post, high-end suspension, and a higher-end frame that's apparently a little bit lighter. The cheapest option, the least expensive option, $10,100. So that gets you a Performance 38 SLX drivetrain and a Fox Float X shock, as well as Code R brakes. That's $2,600 cheaper. What are you doing?
I mean, it's a lot of money either way for any bike.
I couldn't spend more than 10 grand on a bike.
I mean, it's $10,000. That's getting to a big chunk of cash, and especially when you compare it to things like the Commencal, where their builds start around 6.
Yeah.
You've got the Norco, admittedly without a battery, but start around 5.
The Commencal, though, to be fair, it is not the Yeti. Like, the Yeti is finished beautifully. It feels like a much more cohesive package than the other e-bikes.
It's slightly more highbrow than that, but I mean, it's a huge amount of money for a bike, especially when there are things like Commencal, which will do the job, are available.
Yep. Okay, we're on to pros and cons. We're gonna start with the good stuff, Matt. Tell me the things that you liked.
Yeah, I really loved this suspension. It was pretty mind-blowing, actually. It just stayed on the ground and felt really active and lively without doing anything weird. Had really good small bump, it had really good mid-stroke and good bottom out support too. Just always felt like it had traction and good support to even pick the bike up. For an e-bike, this is not super characteristic of those. And the geometry, is a little more conservative, but I think it's gonna work for a lot of people in a lot of different places.
Yeah, more all around than focused on just being a monster truck through the stuff.
Yeah.
Henry, tell me some cons.
We talk about the geometry. One thing that is probably just on the wrong side of the arbitrary line that is 2 long seat tubes, it comes in at 450mm for a large. And that, we've been talking about it earlier on today, and it felt like we kind of settled at around 440. 445, you could just, by the skin of your teeth, get away from it. 450 is getting quite long, especially with a 78-degree seat tube angle. It could run into some problems. Although I would say it does have a very long insertion depth, if that gets us any kudos back. And the last thing would be that handling that isn't going to intimidate some people, it will not be slack enough for others. Because let's not forget, this is a bike that Yeti have had in the works for years, and it'll probably stay in the line for years. And I would imagine in 3 years' time, bike geometry will be all the more progressive still, and this bike is still going to be sold, and I think it'll be overtaken, although it's quite sort of contemporary right now.
Yeah. All right, we're almost out of here, but first we have to talk about the type of rider that the Yeti 160E best suits, as well as the type of terrain. But first, Henry, what kind of rider is this bike best suited for?
We've seen some of these bikes, like the Norco is basically a downhill bike with a motor. The long rear end, the slacked out geometry. I think this is a great e-bike for someone who knows they don't want a downhill bike. A bit more all-rounded. They're not looking for something that's just going to slug out laps. They want something maybe a bit more nuanced than that.
Right, and someone who maybe doesn't mind some good technical climbs, right?
Absolutely. This bike was by far and away my favorite e-bike to climb.
Right. Matt, I want you to tell me the type of terrain that this bike best suits.
Well, we know Yeti's from Colorado, and I can definitely see it being tailored to some of the more technical climbing, tight switchbacks, but still working well for, I would say, the average rider on like rolling single track. You're not gonna lose a lot of energy if you have to pump this bike. Even though it's an e-bike and it's heavier, that suspension is just amazing. It's really rewarding and has lots of grip.
All right, there you go. That is the gist of the new Yeti 160E. We've got more reviews coming, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of them, especially the Huck to Flat and the Impossible Climb. You're up for that, Matt.
Oh boy, here she comes.
We'll see you guys there.